ETSI Security Conference, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Adrian Scrase, CTO within ETSI. Thank you, Adrian, so much for joining me. Could you start by just introducing yourself a little bit and ETSI and your role here?
Yes, thank you. I mean, as Chief Technical Officer of the Institute, my primary role is to take care of all of the operational side of the production of ETSI standards, and that includes supporting the groups that write the standards through to their final publication. But I also play a role in the management of one of our partnership projects called 3GPP, which is primarily responsible for producing mobile generation standards, 2G, 3G, 4G, and now 5G.
Yeah, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about a bit about today. At the moment, all over the world, 5G is being rolled out, increasing connectivity and a host of new applications, possibilities, use cases. But where are we really with 5G standardization, especially with ETSI's activities?
I mean, in terms of 5G and standards, the standards are complete, defining both the radio and the core network, which enables those who want to launch 5G services to do so. And I think it's fair to say that having produced those standards, the take-up has been much faster than we thought. So there are now more than 200 commercial networks worldwide deploying at least the 5G radio. Well, what is a little bit surprising is that in most cases it is what we call non-standalone. So it is a 5G radio access to a 4G core network. And we had assumed that I think there would be a greater take-up of standalone, which is 5G radio connected to a 5G core network. And if we look at the whole benefits of 5G, they're really not achieved until you have the latter, until you have 5G radio and 5G core launched. And that's taking a little bit of time to realise.
Why do you think there hasn't been that uptake that you thought there would be?
That's quite a complicated question, but it's not simple. If you're going to launch a 5G core, you're talking about full virtualization. You are talking about full cloudification. You're also talking in most cases of migrating from the 4G core you have today to the 5G core you have tomorrow. So there's a lot of moving parts in there, which is why many operators are looking at 5G core and thinking, yeah, we're going to do that. But we're not going to do that right now.
Yeah.
There also needs to be a compelling business need. The fact that the standards exist doesn't necessarily mean operators will deploy them. So it's a very careful and calculated decision by an operator to say, we are going to launch 5G core on this particular date. So perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised that there is that period of contemplation between standards availability and deployment. But again, the difficulty is that the full value of 5G will not be achieved until they take that big step.
Okay, and how long do you think it will be in the next few years, perhaps, that 5G will really reach that point?
I think we already have the first launches of 5G standalone, and I think confidence is built when you see deployments that are compelling. So you can see by experience that yes, it's available, it works, and it works well. And you can learn from those who are the early adopters of the technology. You can learn from their experience of making this migration. And once you have that confidence, it might encourage more operators to take that step.
Okay. And how do you see kind of the future of ETSI and the standards in this area developing the next few years?
In terms of 5G, it's a very interesting future, actually, because on the one hand, we're trying to meet the needs of entirely new user communities that we haven't worked with before. Okay. So if we go back to 4G, it was really delivering services to people, to citizens, and doing so in a compelling way. What we're doing for 5G is really trying to look at industry sectors, for example, smart factories or the medical industry, maritime, transport, and saying we have a technology that will help you transform your business operations into something which is much more efficient, lower cost, and has a built-in future evolution, if you like. Because in most cases, those sectors have chosen technologies which you deploy on day one, and 20 years later they need to be replaced.
Yeah.
Whereas if once you jump onto this mobile evolution stream, it's one of continuous evolution. So you have to continually upgrade, but your system doesn't become out of date by 10 or 20 years. But of course, if we're going to do that, we really have to understand what the needs are of those specific communities. And that's the challenge right now. We're trying to understand what these industry sectors want. And of course, security is an important part of their requirements. In many cases, if you're running your entire business operation using a 5G technology, you need to have full trust that it's going to work well, the data you have within the network is secure. Rogue agents can't take your network down, because if it does, your entire production line will stop. So the security is an inherent part of this requirements gathering process to understand what these new user communities need. And then we have to look at the sort of solutions we can put in place that will meet their needs.
Yes, because as you're saying, 5G, it offers all these possibilities with increased connection, but it also opens potentially up for more attacks. And you mentioned security especially, which is obviously at Cybersecurity Magazine we're very interested in. How important is security for ETSI with regards to its standardizations, especially for 5G?
I mean, in all of ETSI's work, not just in 5G, but in all of the systems we design and standardize, as time goes by, security becomes more and more important. And there was a time where we would look first at the system design, come up with a great solution, and then consider how we could make that solution secure. And that's a very old-fashioned way of looking at system design. What ETSI does these days is, look at the problem, come up with a solution. But in designing the solution, the security requirements are taken into account in parallel to the development of that solution. So it's not something you think about once you have your system design. It's something that's an inherent part of this design. And in fact, for 5G, it was very interesting that the security analysis, the security study, was actually completed before we even defined the 5G radio. So it was something that was way up the front of the design process in saying, whatever we do, we must make sure that this is much more secure than previous generations.
Yeah, that's interesting, because at Cybersecurity Magazine, we often come across the problem of at what point do you think about security? And for many cases, it may be an afterthought, or at least after something's developed, whereas really it should be throughout the process. It's interesting to hear that for 5G it started like that. Indeed,
and I think the important point is that the job is never over.
Yeah.
So you write your standards, you define 5G, I've told you 200 networks will be deployed. That doesn't mean to say we can tick the box and say security is done. It's a continuous threat. We know there are people out there who try very hard to bring down our networks, and they will continue to do so. So you always discover, in the life of a technology, you always discover new threats that maybe you weren't aware of at the beginning. So it's a constant process. We can never say the job's done.
No, and I guess that's for standardization in general, right?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, how far ahead really does ETSI look? Because we've talked a lot this week about 5G, but obviously, especially in the media, there's a lot of talk about potentials of 6G in like 10 or 15 years so time. How far do you look in this kind of case?
Oh, there's two parts to that question. I think if you want to look at it from a timing point of view, the standards we write tend to be 2 to 3 years ahead of deployment.
Okay.
So if you want to know what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years' time, if you look at the standards that are being written today, that gives you a very good indication as to what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years' time. But that 2 or 3 year window is not sufficient. If we're looking, say, from moving from 5G to 6G, which is something that's probably going to happen 6 to 8 years out rather than 2 to 3 years out, you can't just start the job 2 to 3 years before. So we have what you could describe as pre-standardization activities. And in previous generations, at least in 5G, we tried to guess what those what would be the building blocks, the characteristics that would be inherent in 5G. And from an ETSI point of view, we decided that network functions virtualization and multi-access edge computing were two of the cornerstones that we thought would define 5G. So way ahead of the schedule, we started to investigate those. We did some studies, and history proved us to be right. When we actually got to 5G, they were two of the cornerstones. So for 6G, we're trying to repeat that exercise, and we're already looking and trying to see what will be the important building blocks which might be needed for 6G design. And we've already decided on at least two of those. We know that we will have to go higher in the radio spectrum, so we've started an activity on terahertz communications. Not writing standards, but trying to understand how we can use that technology, what will we do with it, what problem would be solved by using it, is there a use case for it, can we make money doing this? And those in themselves are really quite in-depth studies. We've done the same for reflective intelligent surfaces. These are passive or primarily passive reflectors, so that you can bounce radio signals off of boards to direct the radio beam then towards your user community. And again, it's something we need to understand, study, so that when we do start a 6G work program, we already have a good basis to work from. And I'm rather sure that, again, right at the very beginning, we will do a 6G security study, and we will say, well, based on the experience we have in 5G, if we're designing a new generation, what can we learn from that? What would be the security imperatives for a new generation? Because every time you start a new generation, you basically have a clean sheet of paper, and sometimes it's not easy to introduce new concepts in the middle of a generation. But when you're starting a whole new package, it's the whole book is open, So it's a good opportunity to say, well, from a security point of view, what can we do better next time than what we've done this time?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. That's really interesting, exciting to know that these things are already being thought about for the next generation as well as 5G. Well, great, thank you. I'm sure there's so much more we could say on this, but we're kind of running out of time. But thank you so much, Adrian, for talking to me. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference this week.
You're most welcome. Thank you.